Her bare hand was pressed flat against the inside of the carriage window, and the glass had fogged in a clean oval around her palm. Through that oval, she watched her mother, across a dim drawing room beyond the front steps, bend over a low table and sign something Beatrice could not read. When she lifted her hand away, the oval of clear glass stayed a moment longer than it should have, and inside it, a man walked past the house in the snow, coatless at the shoulder, hatless, his head bent against the wind as if he were neither going nor arriving. And then the frost crept back in from the edges, and he was gone. She did not turn her head to follow him. She had taught herself, over 4 years, not to follow anything that did not bear directly on the work in front of her. And the work in front of her this afternoon was her mother's hand, moving steadily across a sheet of stiff paper. From this distance, Beatrice could not see the ink, only the shape of the letters being made. And even those she read more by the angle of her mother's wrist than by anything else. She knew the shape of her mother's signature, the way one knows the shape of a key one has handled too often. Mrs. Honoria Lanyon was signing a draft of the marriage settlement. Beatrice's signature was not required for another 9 days, and yet her mother was signing today, alone, in the drawing room of a house in Curzon Street that did not belong to either of them, with the curtains half drawn against a sky the color of cold tea. The carriage moved. Beatrice let the window fog over again, and did not wipe it clear. In her cloak pocket, the brass-cased pocket compass shifted against her thigh as the wheels turned, a familiar small weight, the only thing of her father's that had survived the auctioneers, because she had wrapped it in a stocking and buried it under 3 years of old tax accounts at the back of the linen press the week he died. The compass was the size of a walnut. Its glass was scratched. The needle, when she opened the case, still pointed north, with the tired conviction of something that had been doing the same job for 40 years, without ever being praised for it. She had not opened it in the drawing room. She had not opened it on the steps. She did not open it now. She kept her hand in her pocket and let her thumb rest on the closed lid, and counted, as the carriage moved through streets she did not look at, the things she had accumulated over the past several weeks that had made up her mind for her. The first thing was a letter, not addressed to her, lying open on her mother's writing desk in November, in which Sir Crispin Maddox had referred to her as a healthy young animal of breeding age, and suggested that the question of her temperament could be addressed by a firm hand in the early months. She had read it standing up, in the half-minute her mother was out of the room fetching more wax, and she had put it back exactly where she found it, and she had said nothing about it at supper, and she had not slept well that night or the night after. The second thing was the discovery, in December, that her mother had begun to refer to the small allowance from the engraver in Holborn, the allowance that came in plain brown envelopes, addressed to a Mr. B. Lanton at a coffee-house in Cheapside, the allowance that paid for Beatrice's paper and ink and the occasional new pair of boots, as pin money, and to deduct it from the household ledger as such, as if it had appeared by some indulgent magic of Sir Crispin's, as if it were already his to give and to take. The third thing was a remark her mother had made, not cruelly, not even pointedly, while turning the page of a fashion magazine, that a clever girl was a clever girl until she married, and after that she was a wife. There had been other things. There had been the way Sir Crispin's gloves smelt of coal smoke and bay rum together, when he held her hand a fraction too long over the supper table at Christmas. There had been the morning her mother had locked the writing desk and put the key on a ribbon around her own neck, and pretended she had done so absent-mindedly. There had been the slow, careful, accumulating evidence that the life now being drawn up for her on stiff paper in a Curzon Street drawing-room was not a life she would survive in the shape that mattered, and that she had 9 days left to do anything about it. She had not wept. She had not raged. She had taken out a piece of foolscap one night in her own room, by the light of a single candle, and she had written across the top of it, in the small, disciplined hand she used for marking elevations, the question, "What does one do when one cannot say no in any language they will hear?" And she had sat with that question for the length of the candle, and by the time the wax had run down to a stub, she had crossed out the question and written underneath it, in the same small hand, "One does the saying in a language they cannot misunderstand." The carriage stopped. Beatrice did not move at once. Outside, somewhere beyond the fogged glass, a man called to a horse in the patient, flat voice of someone who had been doing it all morning. She let her thumb rest on the lid of the compass a moment longer. Then she drew her hood up, and she stepped down into the snow, and she began to walk towards the inn at the far end of the village of Hartley Cross, where the front window, she had been assured by her own quiet observation over 3 visits, looked directly out onto the lane. The village was small enough that she had memorized it the first time she came through it as a child, sitting on her father's knee in another carriage, when the lane had been mud rather than snow, and her father had named the roof lines for her as if they were the spines of books. The forge, the wheelwright, the chapel with the leaning porch, the coaching inn with its yellow plaster and its black beam and its row of 3 front windows, of which the middle one belonged to the snug, in which her mother's cousin, Mrs. Felicity Croom, took her tea on Tuesdays between 2 and 3 o'clock, with whichever of her acquaintances she had managed to summon, and from which she could see anyone who passed in the lane, and would, by Wednesday morning, have told everyone she knew about it. Beatrice had not chosen Hartley Cross at random. She had chosen it because Mrs. Croom's tongue was the fastest in 3 counties, and because the village was just close enough to her aunt's cottage to walk to afterwards without freezing to death. She had not chosen the man. The man was to be whichever man was sitting in the lane when she arrived. She had decided this in advance because she had not wanted to spend the long minutes of approach choosing, and because choosing felt, in the cold, honest part of her mind, like a thing she did not have the right to do to a stranger. Whichever man was nearest the inn's front window, whichever man was first in her path, she would not look at his face before she did it. She would look at his face afterwards, because she owed him that, and she would give him whatever coin she had in her glove, and she would walk away. He was sitting against the wall of the inn between the front door and the window of the snug. He was thin in the way of someone who had been thin for some time without thinking about it. He had no beard. He had no hat. His hands lay loose on his knees, ungloved, the knuckles raw with cold, but not blue, and at his feet sat a battered tin cup with 3 coppers in it that no one had put there in the last hour. He was looking at nothing in particular, which was, Beatrice realized as she came up to him, the most difficult kind of looking a person could do in a public lane in the middle of the day. He had the stillness of a man who had taught himself to be furniture. She did not say his name because she did not know it. She did not say anything. She knelt down in the snow in front of him, close enough that her cloak fell across his bare hands, and she put her gloved palm flat against the cold, rough cloth at his shoulder, and she leaned in, and she kissed him on the mouth, as if she had been doing it for years. She had counted in her own head to 3. She had not counted past 3 since she was a child learning to skip a rope. She counted now, slowly, because if she counted she would not bolt. 1. The wool of his coat was wet at the seam. 2. His mouth was cold, and then, very faintly, was not. 3. She did not move. 4. She still did not move. She had not planned for 4. She had not planned for anything past the number she had set herself, and the world past the number she had set herself was unfamiliar and very quiet. And inside the unfamiliar quiet, somewhere quite far away, a teacup clinked once against a saucer in the snug behind the window. She drew back. She did it slowly, because she did not trust her legs to do it quickly. She looked at him for the first time, and his eyes, which she had expected to be either dulled or angry or sly, were none of these. They were gray, and they were perfectly awake, and they were looking at her with the careful, unsurprised attention of a man watching a bird that had landed on his wrist for reasons of its own. He did not pull away. He did not startle. He did not protest. "Thank you," he said. Her hand was already in her glove, finding the coin she had put there that morning, a half-crown wrapped in a scrap of linen so it would not chime against the other coins and give itself away. She pressed it into his palm and folded his cold fingers over it, and her own hand stayed there a fraction longer than she meant it to. She did not say, "You are welcome," because that was not what he had thanked her for. She did not say, "I am sorry," because she was not sure she was, and she would not lie to a man whose mouth she had just used. She stood up. She did not look at the window of the snug. She did not look back at him. She walked, with the careful, unhurried pace of someone who has just put a letter into the post, the length of the lane out of Hartley Cross, and 3/4 of a mile up the cart track, and then, only when the village was hidden behind the rise, she sat down in the snow against a stone wall and pressed both gloved hands over her mouth, and did not weep, and did not laugh, and stayed like that until the cold in her feet made her stand up again. In her cloak pocket the compass had not moved. In the lane behind her, Adrian Carow, who was not Adrian Carow, and who had not been thanked for anything in 11 months, was still sitting against the wall of the inn, with a half-crown in his closed hand, and an expression on his face that he himself could not have named. And inside the snug, behind the window, Mrs. Felicity Croom was already setting down her cup. Her aunt's cottage stood at the edge of the village, on the side opposite to where Beatrice had come in. 4 rooms low under a thatch the colour of wet straw, with a green door that had not been painted since before her father's wedding, and a gatepost into which someone, 2 generations ago, had carved the name Lanyon in letters now silvered by weather. There was a single lamp in the front window. Beatrice did not knock. The door was on a latch that lifted to a flat palm, and Mrs. Ardith Penrose, who had heard a step in the lane and known whose it was before the latch moved, had already pushed the kettle back onto the hob. Her aunt looked up when Beatrice came in, and looked at the snow on her hem, and looked at her face, and did not ask. She took the cloak off Beatrice's shoulders and shook it out over the back of a chair near the fire. She poured tea into a thick cup. She set the cup at Beatrice's place at the small table by the window. She sat down opposite, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. Beatrice drank half the tea before she spoke. The cottage smelt of wood smoke and dried mint, and the very faint chemical sharpness of the lamp oil her aunt preferred. Out of the window the lane was already going blue at the edges with dusk. From the road came the sound of the carriage she had hired in town, being turned in the wider place by the chapel. The man she had paid would drive back without her, with instructions to say to her mother, if asked, that he had set her down at her aunt's by her own request, and nothing else. "I have done a thing," Beatrice said. Her aunt inclined her head. "It will be in the village by supper time." Her aunt inclined her head again. Then, in the dry voice that had been the only voice in Beatrice's childhood that ever told her the truth without softening it, she remarked that supper time in Hartley Cross was earlier than most people imagined, and that the kettle would not need to be put on a second time before there was a knock. The knock, when it came, was not at the door. It was a child at the window, sent by Mrs. Croom, with a folded note pressed against the glass. Mrs. Penrose let the child in by the back, gave him a piece of seed cake, took the note, read it without expression, and laid it face down on the table between herself and her niece. She did not read it aloud. She did not need to. The fact of its existence at this hour was message enough. Mrs. Croom would have written to Beatrice's mother by the same post. The note to the cottage was a courtesy and a warning, and a small, contented spite, and the courtesy was the smallest part of it. "Tell me," her aunt said at last, "only what I will need to know in order to be useful." Beatrice told her. She told her about the kiss at the wall of the inn, the man she had not chosen except by the geometry of where he sat, the tin cup, the half-crown, the thank you. She told her about the carriage window and the oval and her mother's hand. She told her about the letter in November and the ledger in December, and the locked desk, and the candle, and the question she had written and the answer she had written under it. She did not embellish. She did not apologize. She did not weep. Her aunt listened with her hands still folded, and at the end she said only one thing, which was that the man at the inn had been thin for at least 3 months, and possibly more, and that whatever else was true, the half-crown had not been a small kindness. "How do you know he was thin for 3 months?" Beatrice asked. Her aunt considered the fire. "The cuff of his coat," she answered, "would have fitted a different man in October." Beatrice set her cup down. "So you have seen him?" "Twice." Mrs. Penrose let the word sit, and did not add to it. The night closed in. They ate bread and cold mutton at the small table. Mrs. Penrose made up a bed in the back room with 2 extra blankets and a warming pan. Beatrice slept for 4 hours and woke at 3 and lay listening to the thatch settle and the wind move along the eaves, and thought, with a clarity she had not expected, about the gray of the man's eyes. She had remembered them, as one remembers a sentence read in a book one has set aside without finishing. They had not been the eyes of a man who slept against walls. She turned this over and over, and could not make it sit flat. And at last she got up and lit her candle, and took out the compass, and opened it, and watched the needle find north in the dark, and closed it again, and went back to bed, and slept the remaining 4 hours, without dreams. She woke to the sound of someone knocking at the green door. It was not yet 8. The sky beyond her small window was the color of weak milk. She heard her aunt's tread cross the kitchen flags and the latch lift, and her aunt say, without surprise, "Oh." Then a pause. Then her aunt said, "Come in out of it." And the door closed behind whoever it was, and the kettle was pushed forward on the hob a second time. Beatrice dressed without hurrying. She braided her hair and pinned it. She did not look at her face in the small, spotted glass above the washstand, because she did not want to see what she looked like the morning after. and she did not want to discover that she looked the same. She went out into the kitchen barefoot in her stockings, because her boots were still by the fire drying, and the man standing inside the green door with his hat in his hand, and snow melting from his shoulders in slow, patient drops onto her aunt's flag floor, was the man from the wall of the inn. He had washed his face. He had not shaved. His hair had been combed with the fingers of someone who did not own a comb. The coat was the same coat. The hands were the same hands. He looked at her across the kitchen, and she looked at him, and neither of them moved, and her aunt, with the unhurried tact of a woman who had run a house for 61 years, said that she had remembered an errand at the chapel and would be back in 3/4 of an hour, and put on her shawl and went out, and closed the door behind her with a small, distinct click that was not, Beatrice realized afterwards, accidental. He did not sit down. He stood in the middle of the kitchen flags and turned his hat once in his hands, as if he were trying to remember what hats were for. Up close, in the daylight, with his face washed, he did not look like a man who had been sleeping in lanes. He looked like a man who had been sleeping in lanes on purpose. Beatrice did not yet have the word for the difference, but her hand, the one in her apron pocket, had closed on the compass without her thinking about it, and her thumb was on the lid. "You came a long way," she said. 4 miles. He looked down at his boots as if assessing what was left of them, and then up at her again. "I came to ask you a question I have no right to ask." She waited. He drew in one breath. It was not a steadying breath. It was a breath taken to make sure that what was about to be said came out in the order he had walked 4 miles in the snow to put it. "Yesterday you chose me. I do not know what you intended to do with me afterwards. I do not need to know. I am going to ask you something now, and you may say no, and I will leave, and there will be no consequence to you from my having asked. Do you understand?" "I understand." "Will you marry me, properly, before a clergyman, with a license I can pay for?" She did not answer at once. She looked at him. She looked at the coat. She looked at the hands. She thought about the half-crown and the thank you, and the 4 miles in the snow. She thought about her mother in Curzon Street, and Sir Crispin's Bay rum, and the letter in November. She thought about the fact that whatever happened in this kitchen in the next 1/4 of an hour, she was not going back to either of them. Why? He did not look away. "Because yesterday you saw a man you had no reason to see. I have spent 11 months arranging not to be seen. I did not know I could still be. I would like to be married to the person who proved that I could." It was not the answer she had expected. It was not even an answer she had imagined possible. It sat in the air of the kitchen between them like the small, distinct click of a door closing on purpose. "You will be marrying a woman who has just disgraced herself in public. I am aware. You will be marrying a woman with no fortune, no family that will own her, no character that the world will recognize. I am aware of that also. You may also be marrying a woman who will never love you in the way that word is used in books." He thought about that one. He thought about it long enough that she watched his throat move once before he answered, and the careful, unsurprised attention came back into his eyes, the same attention he had given her in the lane. "I am not asking for that word. I am asking for the other thing." "What other thing?" The thing you did yesterday. The choosing. She did not say yes at once. She walked past him, in her stockinged feet, to the fire, and she stood at the fire with her back to him for the count of 15, and in those 15 counts she did the only honest reckoning she had done since she was 16 years old. She had ruined herself yesterday in order to escape a contract drawn up by people who had not asked her. She could refuse this man and walk into the world she had made for herself on her own terms, with her aunt at her back and the engraver in Holborn still paying for map signed B. Lanton, and she could survive that world. She had planned to survive that world. The world she had not planned for was the one in which a man had walked 4 miles in the snow to be chosen on purpose by the same hand that had ruined her. And that world, she discovered, standing with her back to a fire in a 4-room cottage at the edge of Hartley Cross, had a different gravity in it than the one she had drawn for herself. She turned around. Yes. He closed his eyes for one breath. Only one. When he opened them again, the careful attention had a crack down the middle of it, and she saw, before he gathered himself, the shape of what he had walked 4 miles carrying. "Thank you," he said, for the second time in 2 days, and she understood, without being able to say how, that this thank you was for the same thing as yesterday's, and that yesterday's thank you had not been for the kiss. Her aunt came back at the agreed 3/4 of an hour. She came in with snow on her shawl and a paper twist of tea from the village shop that she had not needed, and she set the tea on the dresser, and she looked from one of them to the other, and she sat down at the table, and she said, "Well, we are to be married," Beatrice said. Mrs. Penrose nodded once, as if this confirmed a calculation she had already finished. She looked at the man standing in her kitchen. She looked at him for a long, considering moment that he did not flinch from, although Beatrice, watching, saw that it cost him something not to. "You will sleep in the back room tonight, Mr. Carow. Adrian Carow." "Mr. Carow," said Mrs. Penrose, and Beatrice heard, although she could not yet read it, the small comma her aunt placed between the name he had given and the way she said it. Mrs. Penrose got up. She poured a 3rd cup of tea. She set it in front of him. She did not, Beatrice noticed, ask him whether he took milk. The license took 3 days. Adrian Carow walked to the next market town for it on the morning after he arrived, refused the loan of her aunt's neighbor's pony, and came back at dusk with the paper folded inside his coat and a small smear of ink on the heel of his thumb. Mrs. Penrose, who had spent the day setting Beatrice to mending a tablecloth and herself to mending nothing, took the paper from him at the door, read it, folded it again, and put it on the high shelf above the dresser where she kept the deed to the cottage and her late brother's spectacles. The wedding took place on the 4th day, in the chapel with the leaning porch, in front of the elderly curate who had baptized Beatrice and her father before her, and who asked no questions of either party that were not strictly required by the rite. Mrs. Penrose stood as Beatrice's witness. A churchwarden named Hibbert, summoned from the smithy with hay still in his cuffs, stood as Adrian's. Beatrice wore a grey wool gown she had had 3 years, and her mother's pearl earrings, which she had taken out of the dressing case in Curzon Street the morning of the carriage and put in her pocket without thinking about it, and which she discovered only on the chapel steps. She did not return them. She wore them. She decided, between the porch and the altar, that they were the only payment she would ever take from that house, and that they would do. Adrian wore a coat that was not the coat from the wall of the inn. Where the new coat had come from, Beatrice did not ask. It fitted him a little loosely at the shoulders, in the way of a coat hastily bought rather than tailored, but it was clean and dark, and the collar was right, and the man inside it stood at the altar with the same careful, unsurprised attention with which he had looked at her in the lane and in her aunt's kitchen, and he said his vows in a voice that was clear and quiet, and did not catch on any of the words. And when the curate asked him to take her hand, he took it as if he had been given something he was responsible for keeping warm. There was no breakfast. There were no guests. Mrs. Penrose walked them back through the snow to the cottage, set bread and cheese and a small piece of ham on the table, and went out again to the chapel on some unexplained errand of her own that took her the rest of the afternoon. Beatrice and Adrian sat across the table from each other in a 4-room cottage in a village in which, by every customary measure, neither of them had any business being. And they ate, and they did not speak much, and the snow began again outside the window in small, dry flakes that did not seem to want to land. That night she slept in the bed her aunt had made up for her on the first night. Adrian slept on a pallet by the kitchen fire. The arrangement had not been discussed. It had simply happened, in the way of arrangements made by two people who had married for reasons that were not the reasons marriages were customarily made for. And Beatrice, lying awake under the 2 extra blankets, understood that this was a thing they would either talk about later or not at all, and that she did not yet know which she preferred. In the morning she went to find her aunt at the dresser, kneading bread, and asked, without preamble, what her aunt had not been telling her. Mrs. Penrose did not stop kneading. She turned the dough, pressed it down with the heel of her hand, turned it again. The flour stood in a small ring around the board. The fire ticked. Beyond the wall, in the kitchen, Adrian was splitting kindling in the yard, and the small, regular sound of the axe came faintly through the door. There are several things I have not told you. None of them, I think, are mine to tell. One of them I will tell you anyway, because you are my brother's daughter, and because you have married a stranger on 4 days' acquaintance, and because if I do not tell you it, I will have failed in the only duty I currently recognize. Beatrice waited. He has not been a beggar long. He has been sleeping rough on land that is not unfamiliar to him. I do not know who he is. I know what he is not. He is not what your mother's cousin will be writing in her letters this week, and you have not married down as far as the village will think you have. That is all I will say, and you will not press me, because pressing me will not give you the answer you want, and the answer you want is not mine to give. Do you understand? Beatrice understood. She did not understand, but she understood that she was being asked not to ask, and she understood that her aunt had not asked her not to ask anything in her life before, and that the asking now was therefore the answer in another shape. She went out into the yard. Adrian had taken off his coat to swing the axe. The shirt under it was rough linen, clean, mended at one cuff in stitches finer than a man would have made for himself. His arms, when he raised the axe, were not the arms of a man who had been ill. They were the arms of a man who had been working at something for a long time and had only stopped recently. He set the axe down when he saw her and reached for the coat without putting it on. "I would like to walk," she said. He took up the coat over his arm and came with her, without asking where, and they walked, the two of them, down the lane and along the cart track that ran behind the village, to the edge of a small wood, where a stile crossed a wall, and a path went down towards a frozen brook. The snow had stopped. The sky was the high, pale blue of a winter morning that had decided, at last, to be itself. Beatrice walked with her gloved hand in her cloak pocket, around the compass, and she thought, with the same clarity she had felt at 3 a.m. the night of the kiss, about how she was going to do what she was about to do. At the stile she stopped. She took the compass out of her pocket. She did not open it. She held it out to him on the flat of her palm, brass case dulled with handling, the small scratch across the glass catching the light. This was my father's. He looked at it. He did not reach for it. He drank the estate before he died of it. He left me nothing. I hid this in the linen press the week he died, because I knew if I did not, the auctioneers would have it, and because I had not yet decided which of the two of us I was angrier with. I have carried it for 4 years. He still did not reach for it. I am giving it to you, because I do not know who you are, and because you walked 4 miles in the snow to ask me a question you had no right to ask, and because the only honest thing I own is this, and because I would like one honest thing to be between us before the rest of the days happen. Take it. He took it. He took it carefully, the way a man takes a sleeping child from another man's arms. He closed his fingers over it, and he looked at her, and the crack down the middle of the careful attention was there again, and this time he did not gather himself in time. I will keep it until you ask for it back. She nodded. She did not say thank you, because thank you between them had become a word that meant something else, and she was not ready yet to use it in his direction. They walked back to the cottage in the cold blue light, and the compass was in his coat pocket now, and her cloak pocket was empty for the first time since she was 19, and the absence of the small weight against her thigh felt, oddly, less like loss than like a debt paid. That afternoon she sat down at the small table by the window of the back room, and she took out the leather case in which she kept her pens and her ink and her drawing board, and she set up to work as she had not worked in 11 days. The engraver in Holborn was expecting 2 survey sheets of a stretch of the Welsh border by the end of the month. She had brought the field notes with her, in the same pocket as the earrings. She trimmed her pen. She mixed her ink. She drew the first hairline of a contour across the corner of the sheet, and her hand, which had been unsteady for 11 days, was steady. Adrian came to the doorway after a while and watched her. He did not come in. He stood with one shoulder against the jamb, and he watched her hand move, and he watched her face. And after a long time he said, "You draw left-handed." "I do. My father insisted on the right when I was small. The engraver does not care, and so I have gone back to my own." "What are you drawing?" "A piece of the border between Montgomery and Shropshire. There is a river. There are 3 farms. The man at the engraver's pays me 4 shillings the sheet, and he sells them for 30, and we are both content with the arrangement, because he does not know I am a woman, and I do not know how to tell him without losing the 4 shillings. He was quiet a moment. "B. Lanton." Her pen stopped. She lifted her head. "You have seen the sheets?" "Once. In a portfolio at a bookseller's in Holborn. I bought one, 2 summers ago, a stretch of coast in Cornwall. I admired it. I assumed the man's name on it was the man who had drawn it." She put the pen down. She turned in her chair to look at him properly. He had not moved from the doorway. He was looking at her with the careful attention again, but there was something underneath it now that she had not seen before. Something that was not surprise exactly, but recognition. as if a piece he had been holding in one hand had been laid down at last, alongside the piece he had been holding in the other. Where in Cornwall? He named a stretch of coast. He named it accurately, down to the small headland whose elevation she had argued about with the engraver for a week. He named it, she realized slowly, like a man who had not bought the map because he had admired it, but like a man who had bought the map because he had recognized the place on it, and the recognition had not been a tourist's. You know that coast? I have walked it. A fractional pause. Once. She turned back to her work. She did not draw at once. She sat with her pen across her knuckles and looked at the contour line she had just laid down, and she thought, for the first time since the kiss at the wall of the inn, that the question of who exactly she had married was a question she was going to have to answer eventually, and that the answer, when it came, was going to come from him in his own time, or from some other quarter without his consent, and that she did not yet know which she preferred. On the 6th day, Mrs. Penrose recognized him. It happened at the supper table over a dish of stewed apples. Adrian had been at the woodpile most of the afternoon, and had come in with chips of bark in his hair. Mrs. Penrose had set the apples down between the three of them, and had begun to spoon them out, and her hand had stopped, briefly, halfway between the dish and Beatrice's bowl. She had looked across the table at Adrian, and Adrian, who had been listening to Beatrice describe the difference between a hachure and a contour, had looked back, without alarm, and something had passed between them that was not a word. Mrs. Penrose finished spooning the apples. She set the dish down. She poured cream onto her own, and ate 3 spoonfuls before she said anything. And what she said, when she said it, was addressed to her apples. I knew your mother. Adrian put down his spoon. He picked it up again. He set it down a second time. That is possible. She was at school with my sister. A tone that informed Beatrice the sister had existed, and the story was none of Beatrice's business this evening. Your mother had a way of laughing that I have only ever heard one other person use. You have it, when you forget to keep it back. Adrian did not answer. He looked at his bowl. The bowl shook very slightly in his hand, and he set it down on the table and laid his palm flat beside it, as if he were steadying something. I am not going to say anything. I am telling you what I have seen, because I will not eat with a man at my table whom I have lied to by silence. You may do as you think right. Beatrice looked from one of them to the other. She did not interrupt. She had learned over 23 years that the most useful thing a woman could do when other people were exchanging information she was not yet meant to have was to keep eating and let the information accumulate. Thank you, Adrian said, for the 3rd time that Beatrice could count. Mrs. Penrose nodded once and took up her spoon and ate the rest of her apples in silence, and the 3 of them finished the meal as if nothing had been said, and when Beatrice carried the bowls to the dresser, her aunt touched her wrist once, lightly, in passing, in the way her aunt had used to touch her wrist when she was small and had been told something at the dinner table she was not yet old enough to ask about. And Beatrice understood, with the same dry clarity in which she now seemed to understand everything, that her aunt was telling her to wait. She waited. She waited through the rest of the 6th day, through the 7th, through the 8th. She drew her map. She finished the Welsh border sheets and packed them in oilskin for the next carrier. She walked with Adrian to the brook in the mornings and back, and she sat with him by the fire in the evenings, and they did not speak of what Mrs. Penrose had said, and they did not, either of them, sleep in the same room. He kept his pallet by the kitchen fire. She kept her bed in the back room. The cottage was 4 rooms only, and the wall between the bed and the pallet was thin, and Beatrice lay awake on the 8th night and listened to the small, ordinary sound of a man's breathing on the other side of it, and she found that the sound was the sound of someone awake. On the 9th day she asked him. They were at the brook again. He had broken the ice at the edge with the heel of his boot to let her dip her ink pot for the diluted wash she used for shading water on the maps. He had the compass in his coat pocket. He had carried it every day since she had given it to him. She had not asked for it back. She had not, when she thought about it, missed it as much as she had expected to, and she suspected she did not miss it because she could see the small bulge of the case under the wool of his coat at the hip, and the small bulge under the wool of his coat at the hip had become, in some way she did not yet have a sentence for, the answer to where her father's compass was. Who is Adrian Carow? He set the inkpot down on the stone beside her. He did not pretend not to have understood the question. A name I have used for 11 months. Not a false one entirely. Carow was my mother's name before she married. Adrian is mine. I have been Adrian Carow on the parish lists of 3 villages this year. I have not yet been Adrian Carow on any document with a seal. She waited. I will tell you the rest when I have done one thing I have not yet done. I am asking you to wait 3 more days. I am not asking you to wait blind. I am telling you that there is a thing, and that I will tell you the whole of it, and that I would like to be the one who tells you. Do you understand? I understand. I am sorry. She looked at the side of his face. She looked at the bulge of the compass at his hip. She thought about the careful, unsurprised attention in the lane, the 4 miles in the snow, the thank you that had not been for the kiss. She thought about her aunt's hand on her wrist at the dresser. She thought about the man walking past the house in the snow, in the oval of clear glass on the carriage window, on the afternoon she had not yet known she was going to do anything. 3 days. He nodded. He picked up the ink pot and gave it to her, and they walked back to the cottage in the cold blue light. And the snow began again that evening, and it snowed all of the 10th day, and most of the 11th, and on the 12th day the sky cleared, and the lane froze hard, and the village went very quiet, in the way villages go quiet when the cold settles in to stay. And on the 13th night, a man rode up to the green door of the cottage on a tired bay horse, with snow up to its hocks, and a leather case strapped to his saddle. And he knocked. And Mrs. Penrose let him in, and he did not give his name to her, but he gave it to Adrian, who was standing in the middle of the kitchen flags when the door opened, and the name he gave was not Carow. The man was a solicitor. He was perhaps 50, dressed in black, with the wind-burnt face of a man who had ridden a long way in a hurry. He carried under his arm a flat leather case with a brass clasp, and inside the case, when he opened it at the kitchen table with Adrian standing over him, and Beatrice sitting in her aunt's chair by the fire, and Mrs. Penrose standing at the dresser with her arms folded, was a single sealed letter, addressed in a hand Beatrice did not know, to Mrs. Adrian Wensleydale. Beatrice did not move. She did not look at Adrian. She looked at the letter on the table. She looked at the seal on the letter, which was red and large and had been pressed with a signet ring that had a device on it she did not at this distance recognize, but that the solicitor, glancing at her, evidently expected her to. She looked at the solicitor. She looked at Mrs. Penrose, who was not looking at anyone, who was looking instead at the high shelf above the dresser, where the marriage license lay folded next to the deed of the cottage, and Beatrice's grandfather's spectacles, and whose face had the still composed expression of a woman whose calculation had at last been confirmed. Adrian set both his hands on the table on either side of the letter. He stood like that a moment, his head bent, the lamplight catching the bones of his wrists where the cuffs of his shirt had fallen back. Then he straightened. He looked across the table at the solicitor. "I asked for 3 more days. I came as soon as the road opened." The solicitor inclined his head fractionally in apology. "The seal is your stepmother's. The contents I do not know. I was instructed to deliver it into the hand of your wife and to wait for her answer." "My wife." The word came out of him slowly, as if he were testing the weight of it for the first time, although they had been married 9 days. "My wife will not open the letter tonight. She will open it tomorrow morning, if she chooses to open it at all, after I have spoken with her. You will sleep here. Mrs. Penrose will give you the pallet by the fire. I will sleep in the woodshed." "I require no woodshed." Mrs. Penrose, with the dryness she had used for Beatrice's mother for 40 years. "Mr. Wensleydale, your wife will hear you in the back room. The solicitor will have the pallet. I will have my own bed, which is mine, and I will hear nothing of anything that happens between any of you until the kettle goes on in the morning. Is that understood?" It was understood. The solicitor, with the careful exhaustion of a man who had ridden too far, bowed to Mrs. Penrose, accepted the pallet, accepted a bowl of soup, and did not speak again that night. Mrs. Penrose went to her own bed and closed her door with the same small, distinct click she had used on the morning of the proposal. The letter stayed on the table. Beatrice did not pick it up. She did not need to. The address on it had told her everything the address could tell her, and the rest of what she did not yet know was standing in the doorway of the back room with the lamp in his hand, waiting for her to come through. She went through. She closed the door behind her. He set the lamp on the small table where she drew her maps. He did not sit down. She did not sit down. They stood facing each other at a distance of perhaps 3 feet in a 4-room cottage at the edge of Hartley Cross, on the 13th night since she had pressed her bare hand against a frosted carriage window in Curzon Street and watched her mother sign a contract she had not been meant to see. And Beatrice realized, with a dry clarity, but whatever was about to be said in this room would be the most important conversation of her life so far, and that she was not afraid of it. "My name is Adrian Wensleydale. I am the 8th Duke of Wensleydale. I inherited the title 4 years ago at the age of 27 on the death of my father, who left me 3 estates, 3 parliamentary seats, a debt of honor to a man who is now also dead, and a betrothal to a woman I have never met, which he arranged on his deathbed without consulting either of us. I left London 11 months ago. I have been living rough on my own land in 3 counties since. I have eaten in farmhouse kitchens under the name Carrow. I have slept in haylofts and against the walls of inns. I have not been a beggar. I have been a man refusing to be a duke. The distinction matters to me. I am aware it does not necessarily matter to you." She did not interrupt. She had her hands folded in front of her at her waist. She watched his face. "I came to Hartley Cross because there is a steward on the Yorkshire estate who knows me by sight, and who comes to this village on the 2nd Tuesday of every month to visit a cousin. And I had it in mind, on the Tuesday you arrived, to let him find me. I had not yet decided whether I would let him take me back. I was sitting at the wall of the inn working out whether I would or I would not, and a woman knelt down in the snow and kissed me, and I forgot, for the length of that kiss, every argument I had made to myself for 11 months. He paused. He did not look away. I walked 4 miles to your aunt's cottage the next morning because of that. Not for any other reason. I want you to know that. Whatever else I tell you tonight, that part is true. She nodded. She did not speak. She could feel her pulse in her throat. She did not let it into her face. When I came up to your aunt's gate, I saw the name on the gate post. Lanyon. I recognized it. I have had cause to know it for some time, because the debt my father left to a man who is now also dead, the debt of honor, was a debt this man had himself inherited from your father. Your father owed mine a great deal of money, Beatrice. The debt is in my hands now. The papers are in a strong box in my solicitor's office in Lincoln's Inn. Your mother does not know. Sir Crispin Maddox, I am told, has been making inquiries. The debt has been the lever by which a great many things have been arranged around you that you did not know were being arranged. I knew the name on the gatepost. I knew what the name on the gatepost meant. I knocked on the green door anyway, and I asked you to marry me, and I did not tell you who I was, and I did not tell you what I knew. I have not told you for 9 days. I am telling you now. She was quiet for a long time. The lamp guttered once and steadied. Outside the small window the snow had begun again, very faintly, in the way of snow that intended only to dust the lane and not to drift. Inside her chest something had gone very still, the way a room goes still when a long-running clock has stopped and one has not yet noticed the absence of the sound. When did you decide that you would not tell me? He thought about that. He did not pretend to think. On the doorstep, before I knocked. I told myself I would tell you within a week. I did not. I told myself I would tell you within 10 days. I did not. I told myself tonight that I would tell you tomorrow, and the solicitor came up the lane with a letter that was going to tell you for me, and I understood that I had run out of days I was permitted to keep this for myself. Why? Because you had kissed a beggar to ruin yourself. You had not kissed a duke. If I had told you on the doorstep that the man you had kissed was the man whose paper your father had signed, you would have refused me. You would have been right to refuse me. I told myself a number of useful sentences about waiting and protecting and choosing the right moment, and none of them were true. I did not tell you because I was afraid you would not have me, and because I had already decided I wanted you to. He stopped. He looked down at his hands. That was unworthy, I am aware. I am not asking you to forgive it. I am asking you to know it. Beatrice sat down on the edge of the bed. She had not meant to sit down. Her legs had decided for her. She kept her hands folded. She looked at him standing there in the lamplight, in the borrowed coat with her father's compass in his pocket, and her father's debt in his strongbox, and her name on his marriage license on the high shelf above her aunt's dresser. And she felt, very precisely, all the separate things one could feel at once when one was being told the truth at last. I am angry. I know. I am angrier that you did not tell me than I am that you knew. I know. I would like a moment. He inclined his head. He turned without speaking and went out of the room and closed the door behind him with the same care her aunt had used, and she heard the latch settle, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the lamplight, and did not move for the space of perhaps 100 breaths. And when she had finished not moving, she got up and opened the door and called him back. He came back. He stood in the doorway. The letter on the table. From your stepmother. I do not know what is in it. I will read it in the morning. I will read it with you in the room. After I have read it, if I decide it is to be answered, I will answer it. If I decide it is not, I will burn it. Either way, you will not open it without me, and I will not open it without you. Is that understood? It is understood. The debt my father left to yours. Yes. It will be cancelled, not forgiven, cancelled.
There will be a piece of paper signed by you in front of a witness who is not your own solicitor, and the paper will be in my hand by the end of the month, and the strongbox in Lincoln's Inn will not contain it any longer. The debt has been used long enough as a lever against me, and I will not be a duchess whose first marital negotiation is the cancellation of her own father's paper as a wedding present. I will hold the paper myself. Is that understood? It is understood, he said again, and the corner of his mouth, for the first time since she had known him, did something that was very nearly a smile. The compass. He took it out of his coat pocket. He held it on the flat of his palm. He looked at it. I will keep it until you ask for it back. That has not changed. I am not asking for it back tonight. I am telling you that the needle is bent. I noticed it when I gave it to you, and I did not say, "It has been bent since I was 16, and it points 7 degrees east of north, and I have allowed for it for 7 years, and I would like, when I do ask for it back, for the needle to have been replaced. I would like the compass to point true. Do you understand what I am asking?" He looked at her. The crack in the careful attention had closed again, but it had closed around something different than what had been underneath it before. I understand. Then go and sleep, and shut my door behind you, and we will read the letter in the morning. He shut her door behind him. She heard him cross the kitchen flags to the pallet by the fire, where the solicitor was already asleep with his boots off and his coat folded under his head. And she heard Adrian sit down on the bench by the woodbox and not lie down. And she understood that he would not sleep tonight. And she understood that she would. And she understood that the difference between them on this point would not last. And she lay down in her clothes on top of the blankets and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of a woman who has, after a long and accumulating series of weeks, finally heard the truth in a language she could not misunderstand. The letter was from his stepmother. They read it together at the kitchen table in the morning, with the solicitor sitting at a careful distance by the window, and Mrs. Penrose at the dresser pretending to be elsewhere. The letter was 4 pages. It was not unkind. It was the letter of a woman who had been managing an estate in the absence of its owner for 11 months, and who had reached the end of what she could manage in his absence. And it contained, among other things, the news that the woman to whom Adrian's father had betrothed him on his deathbed had 8 months ago married a captain of dragoons in Lisbon, and was not in any position to be married to anyone else, and that the betrothal had therefore lapsed of itself, and that the household at the Yorkshire estate had been told nothing of his absence, and would not be, and that he might come home when he chose, and that he might bring whoever he chose with him, and that she would not ask. Beatrice read it twice. She folded it. She handed it to Adrian. He read it once. He folded it again. He put it down on the table between them. Mrs. Penrose, at the dresser, poured a 3rd cup of tea without turning around and set it on the table, at the place where the solicitor had not yet been invited to sit. And the solicitor, with the small, unhurried bow of a man who had spent 30 years reading rooms, came over and sat down and drank his tea.
And the four of them did not speak for the length of time it took to drink one cup. And at the end of that time Adrian said, to no one in particular, that he would go home in the spring, and that he would not go alone, and that he would not go before the road through the village was clear of ice, and that he would in the meantime mend the kitchen door of Mrs. Penrose's cottage, which had been hanging crooked on its lower hinge since November, and that he would pay for the new hinge himself, out of money he had been carrying in the lining of his coat the entire time he had been Adrian Carow, and that this had perhaps also been unworthy of him, and that he was sorry. Mrs. Penrose, at the dresser, said only that she had been waiting for someone to mention the door. The solicitor rode away that afternoon with a letter from Adrian, sealed with sealing wax Mrs. Penrose produced from a drawer no one had known she had, and a letter from Beatrice, in her own small, disciplined hand, to a man at an engraver's in Holborn, telling him that B. Lanton would continue to send sheets to him from a new address that would be communicated in the spring, and that the next sheet would be a map of a stretch of coast in Cornwall, about which she had recently been told a thing or two she had not previously known, and that the price per sheet would now be 6 shillings, and that she trusted he would find this acceptable. She did not tell the engraver her name. She did not tell him she was a woman. She did not feel, she discovered, that either piece of information was any of his business yet. And she felt, sealing the letter with a small dab of Mrs. Penrose's wax, that the question of whose business it was could wait, like a great many other questions, until spring. Adrian mended the door over the next 3 days. He cut the wood himself in the yard, and fitted the hinge, and rehung the door on a Tuesday morning, and it swung true. He did not, in those 3 days, sleep on the pallet by the kitchen fire. He slept in the back room, on the floor beside the bed, with a blanket and his folded coat, and Beatrice, lying in the bed, did not ask him to come up onto it, and he did not ask. And neither of them, when she put her hand down over the edge of the bed in the dark, on the second of those 3 nights, took the gesture as anything other than what it was, which was a hand. He took it. He held it. He did not say anything. In the morning, when she woke, his coat was folded at the foot of the bed, and the brass-cased compass was sitting on the small drawing table by the window, open, with its lid laid back, and the needle, which had been bent 7 degrees east for 7 years, had been replaced. It pointed true north. There was a small, bright score across the new needle, where Adrian had filed the end to fit the spindle. There was no note. She picked it up. She closed the lid. She put it in the pocket of her gown. He was asleep when she came out of the back room, in the chair by the kitchen window, where the morning light fell in a long, pale rectangle across the worn floorboards. Mrs. Penrose was out at the chapel on what was beginning to be a daily errand none of them were going to ask about. The fire was banked. The kettle was warm. The snow on the windowsill was melting in small, slow drops onto the inside of the sash, and the lane beyond the window was beginning, faintly, to show the dark of wet road through the white. Beatrice took the foolscap and the ink and the trimmed pen out of her case. She sat down at the small table by the window, the one with the worn place at the corner where her aunt had been resting her elbow for 40 years, and she laid out a clean sheet, and she began to draw, in the small, disciplined hand she used for the maps that paid for her paper, a map of the village of Hartley Cross. She drew the forge. She drew the wheelwright. She drew the chapel with its leaning porch. She drew the inn at the far end of the lane with its 3 front windows and its yellow plaster. And she drew the brook at the wood. And she drew, last, the green door of the cottage at the edge of the village, And she did not draw it as a beggar's daughter, or a duchess, or B. Lanton, or a woman who had kissed a stranger on a Tuesday afternoon. She drew it as a cartographer drawing the place she lived. Behind her, in the chair by the window, with his head fallen sideways against the wood and his hand open on the arm of the chair where she could see the small ink smear on the heel of his thumb from the new needle, Adrian was asleep, and the snow on the window-sill was melting, and the compass in her pocket was pointing true. A few moments in this one have stayed with me. The kiss that took longer than 3 seconds, the 4 miles in the snow, the bent needle replaced without a note. If any of them stayed with you too, subscribing keeps the next story close. See you then.